Thank you, Luke, and thank you for the invitation to take part in the conference. I'm already learning a lot. Actually, unlike the other presenters, I don't have any specific expertise in marine or coastal planning, but I have been leading a team that's been investigating reform and changes in planning systems, and particularly how they help to coordinate or cross-fertilize sectoral policies. So I think it is very relevant. I'm very happy to present on behalf of the huge team that was involved in this project. I want to start by going back a bit, though, and having a quick look at the conference brief, which says that it emphasizes that we need to join forces, multiple areas of expertise, get the sectors together and the policy domains, involve the various stakeholders. This is very, very relevant for our ESPON Compass project, where we looked a lot at collaboration, cooperation. We started by calling it integration, as Luke's just mentioned, but I'm wary of that word now, and I much prefer the notion of cross-fertilization, which I should say came from ESPON, not from the team. We're also
presentation mode, Vincent, with your presentation.
Oh, thank you, Luke. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Yeah, we're also involved in engagement and thinking about how planning systems have been changing there. And if we're talking about collaboration, then we need more adaptive tools. Hopefully I'll have a chance to say a bit about that later. But as I say, we start there with our ESPON Compass project, but I want to go back because I'm old enough to remember in the late 80s and early 1990s when we were talking about very similar things. We were talking about integrated coastal zone management. Now, I know that that's different to what we're talking about today, and the situation has changed radically, but the language was very similar. We were talking about cooperation, coordination, integration of sectoral policies. And a lot of progress was made, I have to say. There's some very good examples of case studies which the OECD reported on, even at that stage where progress was being made. But I want to emphasize that it's very, very difficult. Policy silos are the norm, and they have benefits as well. And also the traditional planning approaches and ways of working are very deeply entrenched. They're embedded, so it's a very difficult thing to do. So it's not surprising that policies continue to collide and crash, and they really combine. So in the ESPON Compass project, we asked what progress are we making on improving our tools for integrated, coordinated policy making. And I'm going to very quickly, I'm just going to give you a hint of some of the work that we did in the ESPON Compass project. We looked at the 32 ESPON countries, and we looked at a period from 2000 to 2016. We also took an extra 7 countries, which we looked at only just an exploratory study in relation to those countries. The findings, of course, involving 39 countries are very general, and they don't address the vast differences in approach. So some of you may think this is something of an oversimplification and generalization. Yes, it is, but I think it's important for us to know what the general trends are. We worked with experts in each country who also consulted other experts to give us feedback on what was happening. We have since then been working on updating that expert opinion with a dialogue. And later this year, hopefully in the summer, we're going to be publishing a policy brief on practical steps that can be taken to improve cross-fertilization. That is, strengthen the relations between the sectoral policies, including spatial planning and cohesion policy, which is figured quite prominently today. So I'm just going to give you a little glance at or a taste of the findings, looking first at this coordination, cooperation issue, you see on this chart, I've got on the left-hand side, I've got levels of integration or levels of coordination or cross-fertilization, from not at all to sharing information, cooperation, some adjustment of policies, strong coordination, and then complete integration. And we looked at all the 32 countries and we came up with some results there. And the findings are generally positive, that the countries, the experts report that there's been a lot of progress from the year 2000. And just as an aside, I'd mention that a lot of that is to do with the European Union policies, and starting with the ESDP, which promoted a spatial planning approach back in the 1990s, or promoted much more integration between sectoral policies, using planning to consider the territorial impacts of sector policies. Well, I've identified a few countries here, including Greece, and you see our experts recorded that Greece is actually making a lot of progress. And most countries are, but we're starting from a low base where in most cases, we're just sharing information. In fact, that's generally still the case. Our experts report that for most sectors, in most situations, the sectors are only sharing information, not much more than that, not really cooperating or collaborating. In a bit more detail, this is what happens in relation to particular sectors. On this, I've identified the countries here. You see the countries down the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we have the sectors, and there's maritime policy there. And we're looking here at both the national level, the subnational level, and the local levels. And we're trying to see to what extent each of these policies at those levels are integrated, coordinated, informed, or neglected, ignored, some would say. So, and I want to reveal the results. I'm going to focus on the maritime policy here, and I'm going to have a look at Greece. So you see, it's a very mixed picture. There are very few patterns in this. For each sector in each country, it has a different sort of impacts. Of course, for many countries, they feel that maritime policy is not relevant for them. But let's just have a look at Greece there. You see, in that pink color means that what our experts tell us is in relation to maritime policy, there's only information supply. There's a flow of information between maritime policies and between other sectors and spatial planning. And Greece is not out of the ordinary there. That's what's happening in much of Europe. So, and you can see the dark red across this this diagram here shows that for many policies in many countries, the idea of any sort of cross-fertilization is completely neglected. I'm going to jump ahead though, and not go through the analysis or the findings which are available on the website, but have a look at what we're doing this year, where we're trying to identify the practical tools that can help to cross-fertilize sectoral policies, which would include those from the land and the sea. And I have 2 points to make to start off with here. First of all, we have a set of preconditions, and it doesn't matter what tools you have. I don't think people have really mentioned that yet today. It doesn't matter what sort of tools you have, but if you don't have professional capacity or professional or political will or good governance, you're going to find it very difficult to do anything positive. And I think that has been a problem in the past. Clearly, it's been a significant problem, and why we haven't made more progress so far. The other thing is, we need to quickly address the negative impacts of current plans and policies. We still have plans and policies which are very detrimental to any sort of cross-fertilization or working together. One of those would be the perverse subsidies that we often apply. I say I'm not an expert on maritime matters, but I did have a quick look into this on the subsidies in the maritime field, and we find that the International Transport Forum tell us that the subsidies that go to shipping are often perverse. They create the wrong sort of activity, oversupply of capacity, and which is damaging. So Dave Shaw recently mentioned cruise tourism as well, which is another one that gets subsidies, sometimes hidden subsidies. Fisheries and fishing, tourism. We need to make sure that we're not, with our current plans and policies, producing negative impacts. If we're going to do that, address those things, then the first thing we need to do, and here I'm looking at short-term actions, medium and long-term, the first thing we need is an audit of an evaluation of what's going on. I'm reminded of Jacques Robert's report for the DG Regio many years ago, I think in the 90s or 2000s, called The Costs of Non-Coordination. And this is what needs to be raised. We need to be looking at the costs of this non-coordination, and costs in many different ways: the financial costs, the efficiency costs, but also the ecological or environmental costs and the social costs. And that will help us to get it on the political agenda and make a start of a longer process, a longer term process of monitoring and assessment of the impacts of those investments and decisions. Once we've done that, there's some short-term actions that can be taken that our experts, when we have a dialogue and discussions with them, they tell us this is really very common. We need to harmonize some of the terminology or language between the sectors. That wouldn't be so difficult to do. And we could do that perhaps quite quickly to ensure that we're talking about the same sort of thing. We then need to look at the data, the units of measurement and the performance criteria, and try and ensure that that's consistent. Of course, it won't be exactly the same, but it's consistent across different sectors in spatial planning, in the marine environment, in the energy, in the shipping, in the fishing, that we're looking at the same sort of performance criteria. Once we've done that, and of course, alongside that, we need to develop these cooperation platforms. Now, we've identified lots of different forms of cooperation platforms, and we've heard some today. I was impressed with the presentation about Crete, for instance, where we heard about the regional stakeholders meetings, which is an informal sort of cooperation platform, but that's the sort of thing we need to be doing. In our policy brief, we'll be picking out some examples of this sort of work, so that to provide inspiration, if you like, for others. And then, of course, there are many different sorts of formal or statutory cooperations to platforms too. There are other things we need to think about in relation to cohesion policy. Cohesion policy is very powerful. The people that handle the cohesion policy funding are very powerful actors and players. That funding currently is conditional on certain actions, but that's not always working, is it? Frankly, it just doesn't work. And our experts tell us that it doesn't always work. And we need to be tougher and more strict about conditional funding and the obligations that come with that money. And then finally, people have been talking about reforming planning tools. We have to work on this, but I think that's at least medium to long term. It's very, very difficult. As I said at the beginning, the ways of planning, the ways of governance are deeply embedded in particular places, and with the best intentions, it's still very difficult to make changes. In Greece, of course, we have an imperative planning system, one that's quite rigid and has been top down. I know that changes are taking place, but it's difficult to change that. Often it's the professional cultures that hold back change, not the desire, but there are ways of working that are just deeply rooted. I'm going to illustrate the change that I see with this diagram. This is just to finish off here, to say what sort of movements we would expect to see from the project. On the y-axis here, we need to see a move from the control, an imperative view of planning, command and control sort of planning, to more cooperation sort of planning. And we need to see a shift from narrow scope to a wider scope. Perhaps those points are obvious, we're going to widen, we're going to cooperate. But I want to emphasize that, I'm sorry, so let's start there with urban planning. That's where we are now, I think. In many countries in Europe, we have an urban planning system that's very much about controlling, has a narrow scope on the physical environment, whether that's land or perhaps water as well. And we need to move to a spatial planning, which is more about cooperation indicative. I would say here, though, it's not about replacing that urban planning system. Of course, we need to retain quite strict and rigid controls on some sorts of activity and in some sorts of places. So I'm not trying to replace that. I'm saying we want to complement the existing urban planning systems. And what we've found is that in most countries, that is happening. I should also point out that this isn't suggesting a return to comprehensive state planning, which in Eastern Europe, of course, they're very familiar with, but it's not a return to that because whilst we have a wider scope, we're cooperating and we're engaging with stakeholders and not commanding top down. There's one very important point here, though. We don't see the creation of the spatial planning as an integrated plan. And that's been mentioned by a few speakers today. Let's have an integrated plan. That's what we need. And I think the history shows from the 90s, perhaps the 80s, that that's just so difficult. It's impossible. And is it wanted anyway? Because there are benefits in the silos.
Recording in progress.
Benefits. So what we see is a set of tools, a long list of tools that we need to think about to complement our urban planning system, which
Recording stopped.
Much more cooperation, producing a single integrated plan, but is developing a portfolio of tools which can assist in this coordination, cross-fertilization. And it would have to be very selective as well. So that's just a little taste of what we've been working on in Compass and what's going to come later this year in our policy brief. And I hope you do have a look at the policy brief when it's produced. I think it's relevant to what we've been talking about today. Thank you very much.